and a positive outcome to these discussions. Well, as I mentioned previously, with me in the studio is Dr. Carla Barnett, who is Secretary General of the Caribbean Community. She became the first woman to hold that position when she assumed office on August 15th this year. Dr. Barnett is an economist who has worked across the English-speaking Caribbean, breaking several barriers along the way. She was the first woman to be appointed as Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Belize, the first woman and the youngest person to be appointed as Deputy Secretary General of CARICOM. Dr. Barnett is a longtime advocate for gender equality, not only because it is the right thing to do to create a more stable and equitable society, but also because she believes that gender equality is good economic policy. So Dr. Barnett, I pose the first question to you. From your perspective, which support instruments fall short to address the particular challenges faced by small island developing states? And how can we change these to help national and regional recovery and build resilience for the future?
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that question. Let me say first that I'm really pleased to be here today. UNCTAD 15 being hosted by the government of Barbados, the first time by a small state, by a small island developing state, and by a member of the Caribbean community. I am more than pleased. I am truly proud. And I have to say that the arrangements on the ground here are impeccable. The surroundings are beautiful, and the hospitality is warm and exceptionally Barbadian. So I'm really happy to be here. This meeting provides an opportunity to highlight to the global community the issues and concerns of our grouping, the small island and low-lying coastal development states, and to identify some of the measures that can be taken by the international community to support our efforts to build resilience and to promote sustainable development. SIDS experienced contraction in 2020 at about 3 times the global rate. The devastation to the health systems and to economic activity meant that at exactly the same time that we needed to be able to address the health emergency, our economies and public finances contracted sharply. So we did the best we could. We applied funds that were budgeted to meet other purposes, to meet the needs of the health sector for PPEs, for medical equipment, testing supplies, vaccines. We shifted funds within our budgets to meet basic social safety nets. We repurposed loans and borrowed additional funds. Already high debt burdens grew higher. What has been the response of the international community? The G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which allowed developing countries to temporarily suspend debt service payments to their official bilateral creditors, that's set to expire in December 2021. While this program had potential, it does not cover all middle to high income developing countries, many of which are SIDS. It also does not include private creditors, so that severely limits the potential of its impact. 40% of the developing countries received a credit downgrade in 2020. Furthermore, the new debt arising from the need to address the COVID crisis, together with the existing debt stock, will continue to appropriate significant portions of public resources in debt repayments. This will strangle the ability of our countries to undertake critical public infrastructure investments, which are required for economic rehabilitation. An effective response to this must include significant and broad debt reduction for all developing countries, including vulnerable middle to high income states. Debt reduction should specifically address the buildup due to COVID and due to climate change adaptation. Many SIDS can no longer access multilateral and bilateral concessional funding because of their relative high per capita. We've talked about this a lot. With the reality of our vulnerabilities exposed by the COVID and climate crises, the call for a more appropriate basis for determining access to concessional financing takes on even greater urgency. We have to continue to press for the implementation of the multidimensional vulnerability index. We therefore call on the UN system to intensify collaboration with relevant regional institutions, particularly in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, to make this index a reality. Additionally, we call on the IMF, the World Bank, as well as bilateral and multilateral development partners to step away from the blinders of GDP per capita and apply what we learn in Development Economics 101, that GDP per capita cannot be a measure of development, let alone sustainable development. Resource mobilization for rehabilitation, adaptation, and building resilience remains a priority for CARICOM. The new IMF SDR allocation of $650 billion is a step towards providing additional liquidity to the global financial system. CARICOM member states are likely to receive about $1.7 billion, which is about 1/3 of the funding boost initially projected for the recovery of CARICOM states. The call by the IMF Managing Director for countries with strong external positions to channel some of their SDRs to countries which need them most, the pledges already made to expand the resources under the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, and the proposals to challenge SDRs to support structural transformation in vulnerable countries, either through the establishment of a new resilience and sustainability trust or some other form of multilateral development bank initiative. These are all welcome. However, until these new options are developed, multilateral support is on the basis of the same policy menu traditionally and funding instruments that have been used to handle economic imbalances in the past. That menu does not adequately address our inherent vulnerabilities and fragilities, and will certainly be inadequate as the foundation for the design of recovery models that can build transformative and resilient economies in the face of global climate change. As we prepare for COP26, we welcome the recent re-engagement of major players and the commitments to meaningful reduction of CO2 emissions. It is vital that these be honored in order to limit global warming to 1.5 C. For SIDS like us in the CARICOM, 1.5 to stay alive is more than a catchy slogan. It is an existential reality. Successfully addressing our acute vulnerabilities requires SIDS to continue to strengthen technical, financial, and institutional capacity to adapt to environmental and economic shocks caused by climate change. Pledges to the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Funds must be honored and indeed increased in order to ensure that the most vulnerable can adapt and survive. Procedures for access to these funds also need to be simplified. We therefore have to be focused on pushing COP26 to be decisive in order to keep the pathways to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement alive and translating commitments to real action on the ground. COVID-19 is indeed a game changer, but the policy landscape for building resilient economies demands a willingness to think differently, and it requires innovative and transformative actions to address global inequality and drive inclusive growth.
Dr. Barnett, thank you very much for your remarks. I move to our next panelist, Prime Minister the Honorable Mia Amor-Motley, who is a woman of many notable achievements. She was one of the youngest persons in Barbados to be assigned a ministerial portfolio when she was appointed Minister of Education, Youth Affairs and Culture in 1994. An attorney at law by training, Ms. Motley later served as Attorney General and Deputy Prime Minister. She became Barbados's 8th Prime Minister and our first female Prime Minister in May 2018. Prime Minister Motley, I must confess that I feel some reluctance in posing this question to you because I think it might earn me a rebuke. Haven't you been listening to my recent speeches? But nevertheless, I am compelled to ask, what policies and instruments are needed to address the inequalities that we have for far too long endured to foster inclusive recovery, and what are the specific challenges of small island developing states?
I'm actually not going to rebuke you for not listening to my speeches. I think that the Secretary General's comments just now answered a lot of that. And I say so conscious that much of the inequality that we are facing didn't just come about because of COVID. COVID has just laid it bare in a very stark way and has exacerbated it for sure. But the bottom line is that we have a level of inequality and poverty that is a hangover from colonial days and pre-independence days. And the realistic approach is such that even though we have achieved much, the truth is that the economic environment within which we've been forced to function has not necessarily given us the tools to be able to do so. And that's why you hear Dr. Barnett talking just now about not using GDP per capita as a measurement for access to concessionary funding, a recognition that much of the debt that we have undertaken as countries hasn't come because of profligacy or corruption. And even if there are examples of that, it's minuscule. It has come because of a lack of sustained development. When we formed the WTO, as I said yesterday, we have not looked back to see its scars on us with respect to the loss of productive capacity in manufacturing and agriculture. We have had to incur significant amounts of debt over the last 3 decades with respect to climatic events, or with respect to things like simply trying to be able to augment water or distribute water in our societies. And that infrastructural requirement, spending money servicing debt, that is very expensive as compared to debt that other countries can get at very affordable rates, then that additional debt service is taken away from access, paying for education or healthcare or other critical things that are necessary to keep our people alive. What COVID-19 has done has been to exacerbate those social divisions as well. And therefore, for example, persons who are suffering traditionally from chronic NCDs, they have been really, in many instances, put at the side in the course of the last 18 to 20 months, simply because access to healthcare in most hospitals has been limited to people who have been on the front line of the pandemic. In our case here, we were able to take a decision early on to refurbish an old US naval base and literally put it as a dedicated hospital for COVID patients. And I want to thank Mr. Hoyer from the European Investment Bank because they have agreed to come in and to do the financing with respect to that facility, which is retroactive in part, but more importantly, that the concessional framework for financing is very much there with the EIB on this loan. It's a 20-year loan. It has a 5-year moratorium, and the interest rate is, I think, 1.25%. That's the kind of developmental instrument that we need in order to be able to undertake some of the things that will reduce inequality in our societies. But I go further. I've been arguing that this event is not a normal event. It's a cataclysmic event. Some even refer to what is going on now as the equivalent of a World War III. If we accept that, then we must accept that, especially for countries such as ours that have not had the capacity to be able to pump the level of fiscal stimuli in, even when we've had to pump it in, is going to constrain our capacity for post-pandemic to be able to resume the development trajectory. And we're saying, look, there must be a way of taking the COVID debt post-January 2020 and refinancing it into exceptionally long instruments, either related instruments, about a 10-year moratorium initially. Why? Because in the same way that Britain understood that it could not refinance its war debt while trying to pursue post-war recovery, we too will have a difficulty in being able to pursue post-COVID recovery and to reduce the inequalities that have been made more stark by COVID if we do not find a way of having these long-term instruments take some of the immediate pressures of debt service off of us. We also have to have a different perspective as to what is sustainable. If you're going to continue to use the measurement by Rogoff that the anchor should be 60% debt to GDP, all of us are out of it. So that you can't even get back to a point of stability. So this COVID comes at a time when it is going to lead, I believe, to a fundamental rethink of the international financial architecture, as well as some of the instruments that are necessary for us to be able to pursue development. And if we don't do it, regrettably, we're going to see literally a cementing of people back into poverty at the very time that we were expecting to see movement towards the sustainable development goals.
Are you that it can be accomplished?
I think that the majority of people in the world want to do the right thing. And that's why I've framed it in terms of global moral strategic leadership. Global because this is not about a region like the Americas or Asia. It's about the world. Moral because it's about doing the right thing. And strategic is because we can't do everything. So we have to choose the few things that we think we can see and make a change on. And that's why I'm soon going to sound like a parrot. Because one, as it relates to climate, it is about adaptation. The reality is that the ambitions that are being put on the table are not sufficient to close the gap. And we will likely see the world go beyond the 1.5 degrees. Dr. Barnett has told you that this is an existential threat for us. That means that fundamentally in 15, 20 years' time, we can be seeing all kinds of bad things that we don't even want to contemplate. But we have to use now our funds to be able to ensure that we can prepare ourselves for it and minimize the impact of what that more than 1.5 degrees will do for us. At the same time, we have the pandemic too. So I can go on and show what is it really that we're calling for with the pandemic. It's simple. The global rich countries, the rich countries of the world, ordered 5 times more than what they needed in terms of vaccines. In so doing, they left a huge, huge hole for variants and mutations to run through. They now find that they too are compromised because the mutations are affecting them in spite of the high level of vaccinations. So that it makes no sense to us. And I believe that while we may not have a unanimity, clearly, we are getting a reflection of a world that more and more is saying enough is enough. And that you cannot continue to have this kind of stark inequality, not now just at the level of people, but at the level of countries. And as I said, we talked about the SSI just now, Dr. Barnett spoke about it, the debt service suspension initiative. Clearly, they're going to have to look at extending it beyond December 2021. But here's the problem. It was never sufficient for the purpose for which it was intended. So therefore, even if you extend it, which you must for some countries, it has not met the needs of other countries in being able to go forward and allowing us to ease the pressure of the debt service in the middle of a pandemic when you want to be literally servicing your people instead of servicing your debt in that high way, as the Secretary General of the UN said yesterday. So I hope that we will find more and more persons recognizing that at this point in time, we need to do the right thing by the world, by the planet, and by our people. And the countries that have now to make those decisions are a few, but they operate on the basis of self-protection first, which I understand in part, but self-protection is not going to carry you the journey. And we saw it, as I said, most evidently with the vaccines. Self-protection will give you an immediate feeling of comfort, but it's not going to protect you for the long run. And that's the message, perhaps more than anything. To go for the long run, we need to go together and not individually.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Peter, with that, I turn the proceedings back over to you.
Many thanks, Sharon. And one thing that stood out for me there in that little talk there by Prime Minister Motley is the fact that she says most people want to do the right thing. And it just echoes what myself and the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Jerome, were talking about before we came on air. And, you know, it's essentially the same thing that she says, that most people want to do the right thing across the world. We just need governments to key into that fact as well. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Motley. Thank you very much, Sharon. It's now time to introduce our next panelist.